A white officer humiliates a black boy by making him smoke, but he has no idea that his actions will have disastrous consequences for his career. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The town of Masonville seemed like a picture-perfect postcard. Neatly lined streets framed with towering oaks, white picket fences surrounding aging houses, and a quiet, unhurried air that wrapped around its residents like an old, familiar blanket. Yet, for all its charm, Masonville carried the heavy burden of a troubled history. Beneath the surface, the town's true face was etched in the cracks of its sidewalks and whispered in the uncomfortable silences between its people. The town square was its centerpiece, dominated by a weathered monument to the Confederacy that loomed over a modest park. To some, it was a symbol of heritage. To others, a glaring reminder of a past that refused to let go. Masonville had long been a place where old grudges lived on, where systemic divides ran deep, and where change was viewed with suspicion. The air here was thick, not with heat or humidity, but with the weight of unspoken tensions. In a small duplex on the edge of town lived 12-year-old Tyrone Harris. Tyrone was a boy of vivid imagination, a budding artist with a knack for capturing the world as he saw it, though not always as others wanted it to be. His drawings filled the pages of his tattered sketchbook scenes of joy, pain, and resilience. Tyrone's favorite pastime was retreating to his quiet corner of the world, drawing what he dreamed could be possible, even if reality often painted a different picture. His family was his anchor. His mother, Deborah, worked 2 jobs, days cleaning houses for the wealthy families in the suburbs and nights at the local diner, where the tips barely covered the bills. Deborah carried herself with an unyielding dignity, though the strain of her sacrifices showed in the lines of her face. Tyrone's older brother, Jamal, was his role model. At 22, Jamal was fiercely intelligent and deeply principled, often speaking at local meetings about the need for justice and equality. To Tyrone, Jamal was the living embodiment of strength, though their mother often worried that his fiery activism would draw unwanted attention. Life in Masonville for a young black boy like Tyrone meant learning unspoken rules. Deborah drilled them into him from an early age. Don't run in public. Don't linger too long in stores. Always address police officers with respect, no matter what. It wasn't a question of fairness, it was survival. Tyrone knew these lessons by heart, though he never fully understood why they had to exist at all. One sunny afternoon, Tyrone found himself at the school parking lot, waiting for Jamal to pick him up. He sat on the curb with his sketchbook, pencil in hand, capturing the scene around him. He liked the symmetry of the parked cars, the way the sunlight reflected off their windshields. His focus was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of crunching gravel, followed by the hum of an approaching engine. A patrol car rolled to a stop a few feet away, and Tyrone's stomach tightened. The man who stepped out was Officer Jackson Moore, a fixture in Masonville. To most of the town's residents, Moore was the ideal policeman, firm but fair, a protector of the town's values. To Tyrone, the man exuded an unsettling energy. Moore was tall and broad-shouldered, his neatly pressed uniform spotless, his polished badge gleaming in the sunlight. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What you got there, son?" Moore's voice was casual, almost friendly, but Tyrone sensed an edge beneath it. Tyrone hesitated, clutching his sketchbook. "Just drawing, sir." Moore crouched down, his smile widening as he gestured for the sketchbook. "Mind if I take a look?" Tyrone hesitated, glancing around the empty parking lot. There was no one else in sight, no one to witness the exchange. Reluctantly, he handed the sketchbook over. Moore flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "You're pretty good," Moore said, though his tone was flat. He stopped on a page depicting a figure standing against a backdrop of flames, a superhero Tyrone had imagined. The figure's face was obscured, but the body language radiated defiance. "This supposed to be you?" Moore asked, tapping the drawing with a thick finger. "No, sir," Tyrone said quickly. "It's just something I made up." Moore closed the sketchbook and handed it back, his eyes locking onto Tyron's. "Well, make sure you keep it that way. Don't let your imagination get you into trouble." Tyrone nodded, his grip tightening on the sketchbook. Moore straightened up, adjusted his belt, and smiled again, this time with an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "You have a good day now," Moore said before walking back to his patrol car. The car rolled away, leaving Tyrone alone with a racing heart and a lingering sense of unease. By the time Jamal arrived, Tyrone had forced himself to bury the encounter, though his hand shook slightly as he climbed into the passenger seat. Jamal noticed. "You good, little man?" Tyrone nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Jamal didn't press, but as they drove home, Tyrone stared out the window, his mind replaying the encounter. Something about Officer Moore's words and the way he looked at him felt wrong, like a shadow creeping into a place it didn't belong. At home that evening, Deborah fussed over dinner while Jamal filled her in on his latest community project, organizing a town hall to address racial profiling in Masonville. Tyrone listened quietly, his thoughts still swirling around the parking lot. When Deborah asked how his day was, Tyrone gave a half-hearted fine before retreating to his room. In the solitude of his space, Tyrone opened his sketchbook and flipped to the page Moore had commented on. He studied the superhero figure, now feeling a strange sense of vulnerability about it. Slowly, he picked up his pencil and began adding details, making the lines bolder, the stance more resolute. If the world outside wanted to make him feel small, his drawings would be a sanctuary, a place where he could stand tall. But even as he lost himself in the strokes of his pencil, Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The quiet town of Masonville didn't feel so quiet anymore, and in the restless shadows, trouble was beginning to stir. The evening air was heavy with the scent of summer, a mix of freshly cut grass and the faint musk of asphalt baking under the day's sun. Tyrone walked briskly along the edge of Elm Street, a loaf of bread tucked under one arm. His mother had sent him out for a quick errand after dinner, the corner store just a few blocks away. Normally, Tyrone enjoyed these solitary walks, his mind drifting to the characters and worlds he would sketch in his notebook. But tonight felt different. The streetlights flickered as if they, too, were uncertain of their place in the quiet night. Tyrone pulled his hoodie tighter around him, his sneakers scuffing the sidewalk as he hurried home. His heart leapt when he heard the low hum of an engine behind him, the sound growing louder with every passing second. He didn't need to look back to know what it was. A police cruiser. The car slowed as it approached, its headlights washing over Tyrone like a spotlight. He kept his eyes forward, forcing himself to appear calm, though his grip on the bread tightened. The cruiser pulled to the curb just ahead of him, and the driver's side window rolled down. The familiar voice that followed sent a chill down Tyrone's spine. "Well, well, out for a stroll, are we?" It was Officer Jackson Moore. He leaned out of the window, his expression half smirk, half sneer. Tyrone froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, though he knew better. Running wasn't an option. It never was. "Yes, sir." Tyron said, keeping his voice steady. "Just heading home." Moore opened the door and stepped out, his polished boots crunching against the gravel. The overhead light of the cruiser illuminated his figure, making him appear larger than life. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on his hips as he regarded Tyron with an unsettling intensity. "Little late for a kid like you to be out, don't you think?" Moore asked, taking a step closer. Tyron swallowed hard. "I was just picking up bread for my mom." Moore raised an eyebrow, his gaze dropping to the loaf tucked under Tyron's arm. He reached out and took it without asking, turning it over in his hands as if inspecting it for contraband. "Bread, huh? Nothing else in there?" Moore's tone was casual, but the accusation was clear. Tyron shook his head quickly. "No, sir, just bread." Moore handed it back with a chuckle, though his smile didn't soften. He circled Tyrone slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know, you look like one of those kids who might get into trouble if you're not careful." Tyron didn't respond. He focused on keeping his breathing even, his muscles tense but rooted in place. "Tell you what," Moore continued, stopping directly in front of him, "why don't we make sure you understand how to stay out of trouble?" Before Tyrone could react, Moore gestured toward the sidewalk. "Kneel down, right there." Tyron's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir?" "You heard me," Moore said, his voice turning cold. "On your knees. Let's see if you can follow instructions." Tyron hesitated, the bread trembling in his hands. His mind raced through his options, but none of them seemed safe. Reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the pavement, the rough surface biting into his skin. His heart pounded as Moore loomed over him, his shadow swallowing Tyrone whole. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" Moore said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Just remember, when someone like me tells you to do something, you do it. No questions, no attitude. Got it?" "Yes, sir," Tyron murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Moore leaned down, his face inches from Tyron's. "Good. Now get up and get out of here. And next time, don't make me stop my car." Tyron scrambled to his feet, clutching the bread like a lifeline. Without looking back, he hurried down the street, his legs shaking beneath him. The sound of Moore's laughter followed him like a haunting echo, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time he reached his house, Tyron was trembling. He stood outside for a moment, staring at the warm light spilling from the windows, a stark contrast to the darkness he carried inside. He forced himself to steady his breathing before stepping through the door. Deborah was in the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared lunchboxes for the next day. She didn't notice Tyron's unease at first, too focused on her task. "Thanks, baby," she said, taking the bread from his hands. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Tyron said quickly, his voice tight. "Just tired." She turned to look at him then, her brow furrowing slightly. "You sure?" Tyron nodded, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine, Ma. I'm gonna go to bed." Without waiting for a response, he hurried to his room, closing the door behind him. He sank onto his bed, his head in his hands, the weight of the encounter crashing over him like a wave. He wanted to tell her, to tell Jamal, but the words felt too heavy, too dangerous. What if they got involved? What if it made things worse? That night, Tyron lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. Every flicker of light from passing cars made him flinch, his mind replaying Moore's voice, his commands, his laughter. For the first time in his young life, Tyron felt truly powerless, a pawn in a game he didn't understand but couldn't escape. As the hours stretched on, his fear began to harden into something else, a simmering anger that burned beneath his skin. He didn't know what he could do or how he could fight back, but one thing was certain. This wouldn't be the last time he crossed paths with Officer Jackson Moore. Days had passed since Tyron's encounter with Officer Jackson Moore, but the memory clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He found himself scanning the streets constantly, his stomach knotting at the faintest sound of an approaching car. At school, his focus slipped. Even his sketchbook, usually a sanctuary, offered little comfort. Tyron didn't share what had happened with anyone, not his mother, not Jamal. He didn't know how to explain the hollow ache in his chest or the fear that coiled tightly around him. The next encounter came on a Saturday afternoon, a day Tyron hoped would be uneventful. His mother had sent him to the corner store again, this time with a longer list. The sun was bright and the streets were busier than usual, which gave him a false sense of security. He walked quickly, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Inside the store, Tyron moved with purpose, picking up bread, milk, and a few cans of soup. He clutched the plastic basket tightly, feeling a wave of relief as he approached the counter. A familiar voice shattered that relief. "Well, if it isn't my little friend." Tyron froze. Turning his head, he saw Officer Moore standing by the entrance, leaning casually against a display of potato chips. Moore's uniform seemed almost too crisp, his smile too wide. Tyron felt the eyes of the store clerk and a few other customers shift toward them, but no one said a word. Tyron managed a weak, "Hello, sir," before focusing on placing his items on the counter. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket for the crumpled bills his mother had given him. Moore stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing against the tile floor. "You're not going to say more than that? Not even a thank you for keeping the streets safe?" Tyron didn't look up. "Thank you, sir," he mumbled. Moore chuckled. "That's better, but I think we should have a little chat outside, don't you?" The clerk's gaze darted between Tyron and Moore, but she quickly looked away, busying herself with the cash register. Tyron wanted to protest, to explain he needed to get home, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He nodded, his throat tight, and followed Moore out into the bright afternoon. They stopped on the sidewalk. Moore folded his arms, towering over Tyron like a judge preparing to pass sentence. "You know, I've been thinking about you," Moore said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "You remind me of some of the kids I used to deal with back in the day, always looking for trouble, even if they don't realize it." Tyron shook his head quickly. "I'm not looking for trouble, sir. I just want to go home." Moore's smile widened. "Of course you do. But before you go, let's make sure you're staying on the right path." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. Tyron's heart sank as Moore removed one and held it out to him. "Here, take it." Tyron stared at the cigarette, his mind racing. "I don't smoke," he said, his voice barely audible. Moore stepped closer, his smile vanishing. "I said, take it." Tyron's hand moved on its own, trembling as he reached out and took the cigarette. It felt foreign and wrong in his fingers. Moore leaned in, his voice low. "Now, put it in your mouth." Tears stung Tyron's eyes, but he did as he was told, his body numb with shame. Moore pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, the click of the camera cutting through the oppressive silence. Tyron felt his cheeks burn, his humiliation complete. "See? Not so bad," Moore said, pocketing his phone. "Now you're just like all the others. You're going to tell your mom you were smoking when she sees this picture, or should I send it to your school first?" Tyron shook his head, his voice breaking. "Please don't." Moore laughed, stepping back. "Relax, kid. Just a reminder of who's in charge around here, You can go now." Tyron didn't wait. He bolted down the sidewalk, his legs moving faster than they ever had. By the time he reached home, his lungs burned and his vision was blurred with tears. He pushed open the door and ran straight to his room, ignoring his mother's calls. Inside, he collapsed onto his bed, clutching his sketchbook to his chest as if it could shield him from the memory. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to erase the shame that clung to him like a second skin. Instead, he buried his face in his pillow, his body racked with silent sobs. Hours later, Jamal knocked softly on his door. "Ty, you okay in there?" Tyron wiped his face quickly, trying to steady his voice. "Yeah, I'm fine." Jamal hesitated. "You sure? Ma said you seemed upset." "I'm fine," Tyrone repeated, forcing the words out. "Just tired." Jamal didn't press further, but Tyron could hear the concern in his voice as he walked away. Alone again, Tyrone opened his sketchbook and turned to a blank page. His hand moved almost involuntarily, the pencil scratching furiously against the paper. He didn't know what he was drawing until he stopped and looked at the page. It was more. The lines were sharp and dark, his face twisted into something monstrous. Tyron stared at the image, his heart pounding. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. Anger. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start. He tucked the sketchbook under his pillow and lay back, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but somewhere in the depths of his mind, a thought began to take shape. Moore had power, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight back. Tyrone didn't know how yet, but he clung to the idea like a lifeline. The days following the last encounter with Officer Moore were a blur for Tyrone. The weight of the humiliation pressed on him, making it hard to breathe. He avoided eye contact, spoke in monosyllables, and spent most of his time holed up in his room. Deborah noticed the change in her son, but attributed it to the moodiness of adolescence. Jamal, however, sensed something deeper. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of orange and purple, Jamal knocked gently on Tyron's door. "Hey, Ty, can we talk?" Tyron was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a sketch he couldn't finish. He hesitated, but then mumbled, "Yeah, come in." Jamal entered, closing the door softly behind him. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying his younger brother. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Tyron shrugged. "Just school stuff." Jamal wasn't convinced. He pulled up a chair and sat facing Tyrone. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" For a moment, Tyrone considered spilling everything. The fear, the shame, the anger, but the thought of reliving those moments made his stomach churn. "It's nothing, really," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamal sighed, his eyes filled with concern. "Ty, I've noticed you've been different. If something happened, it's just—" Tyron interrupted, then stopped himself. The words caught in his throat. "Just what?" Jamal prompted gently. Tyron took a deep breath. "Do you ever feel like no matter what you do, people see you a certain way? Like they expect you to be something you're not?" Jamal nodded slowly. "All the time. Especially around here." Tyron fiddled with his pencil. "What do you do about it?" "I try to change their perceptions, stand up for myself and others, show them they're wrong." Tyron looked up, meeting his brother's gaze. "But what if they're the ones with all the power? What if standing up just makes things worse?" Jamal leaned forward. "Is this about someone in particular?" Tyrone hesitated, then finally whispered, "Officer Moore." A flash of anger crossed Jamal's face, but he kept his voice steady. "What about him?" Tyrone's eyes filled with tears as he recounted the encounters, the stops, the humiliations, the cigarette incident. He spoke haltingly at first, but the words came faster as he went on. Jamal listened intently, his jaw tightening with each detail. When Tyrone finished, Jamal reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You should have told me sooner." "I was scared," Tyrone admitted. "I didn't want to cause trouble." Jamal shook his head. "This isn't your fault. Moore had no right to treat you that way." A steely resolve settled in Jamal's eyes. "We can't let him get away with this." Tyrone looked anxious. "What can we do? He's a cop. No one will believe us." "Maybe not if it's just us," Jamal said thoughtfully. "But what if there are others? People he's done this to before?" Over the next few days, Jamal began discreetly reaching out to members of the community. He visited local hangouts, spoke to kids at the basketball courts, and chatted with neighbors on their porches. The stories he uncovered painted a disturbing pattern. There was Malik, a 17-year-old who had been stopped and frisked by Moore multiple times without cause. He recalled an incident where Moore had threatened to arrest him for loitering while he was waiting for a friend outside a store. Then there was Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who remembered Moore harassing her grandson, implying he was involved in gang activity simply because he wore a hoodie. A young mother named Keisha shared how Moore had followed her home one night, accusing her of drug possession when all she had were groceries. Each story added a piece to the puzzle, revealing a man who abused his power to intimidate and oppress. However, convincing people to speak up was another matter. Fear was deeply rooted in the community. Many were reluctant to go on record, afraid of retaliation. "I'm sorry, Jamal," Malik said, his eyes darting nervously. "I can't risk getting involved. My mom would kill me if I got mixed up in anything." Mrs. Johnson sighed heavily. "I've lived here a long time, honey. I've seen what happens when folks try to stand up. They get crushed." Keisha shook her head. "I have a little girl to think about. I can't afford to make enemies with the police." Frustration gnawed at Jamal, but he understood their hesitation. The system was stacked against them, and challenging it seemed impossible. One afternoon, Jamal sat on the front steps of their house, sifting through his notes. Tyrone joined him quietly, holding 2 sodas. "Any luck?" he asked, handing one over. Jamal took the soda gratefully. "Some. People have stories, but they're scared to talk." Tyrone sat beside him. "Maybe we should drop it. I don't want anyone else getting in trouble because of me." Jamal turned to face him. "This isn't just about you, Ty. It's about all of us. Moore's been terrorizing this community for too long." Tyrone looked down. "What if we can't stop him?" "We won't know unless we try," Jamal replied firmly. That evening, Jamal decided to dig deeper. He combed through public records, searching for any complaints filed against Moore. Unsurprisingly, there were none. Either the complaints had been buried, or people hadn't filed them out of fear. He reached out to a friend, Lisa, who worked at the local newspaper. Over coffee, he explained the situation. "Jamal, you know this is risky," Lisa cautioned. "Accusing a police officer without solid evidence could backfire." "I understand," Jamal said, "but there has to be something we can do." Lisa thought for a moment. "I'll see what I can find. Maybe there are reports or internal memos that aren't public, but you need more people willing to speak up." Jamal nodded. "I'm working on it." Meanwhile, the atmosphere at home grew tense. Deborah sensed the undercurrents but was kept in the dark about the specifics. One night at dinner, she set down her fork and looked between her sons. "All right, what's going on with you two?" Tyron and Jamal exchanged glances. Jamal took a deep breath. "Ma, there's something we need to tell you." He explained the situation with more, keeping his tone measured but not downplaying the seriousness. Deborah's face paled as she listened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked Tyrone, her voice strained. "I didn't want to worry you," Tyron said softly. Deborah reached over and held his hand. "Baby, you can't keep things like this from me. We're family. We face things together." She turned to Jamal. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm trying to gather evidence, get others to come forward," he said. "We can't let him continue hurting people." Deborah sighed heavily. "I worry about you both. Going up against a police officer, it's dangerous." "I know," Jamal acknowledged, "but if we don't stand up now, it'll only get worse." She nodded slowly. "Just promise me you'll be careful." As the days passed, Jamal's determination intensified. He managed to obtain footage from a security camera outside a local store, showing Moore aggressively confronting a group of teens without provocation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He organized a meeting at the community center, inviting those who had stories about Moore. To his surprise, a handful of people showed up. The room was filled with a mix of fear and cautious hope. "We're here because we deserve to live without fear," Jamal began. "Officer Moore has abused his power for too long, but we can't stop him individually. We need to stand together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Malik stood up. "I'll share my story. I'm tired of being afraid." One by one, others agreed to add their voices. The collective courage in the room was palpable. That night, Tyrone approached Jamal as he was organizing his notes. "I'm proud of you," Tyrone said quietly. Jamal smiled. "I'm proud of you, too. It took a lot to tell me what happened." Tyrone nodded. "I want to help. Maybe I can draw something for the meeting, something that shows we're united." "That's a great idea," Jamal agreed. "Art can be a powerful message." Together, they began to craft a plan to bring their community's plight into the light. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time they felt a glimmer of hope. Unbeknownst to them, Officer Moore was becoming aware of the undercurrents of dissent. He sensed that his control was slipping, and it only fueled his resolve to maintain his grip on the community. As the chapter closed, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the strength of a family and the resilience of a community determined to unearth the hidden truths and demand justice. The community center was quiet, the kind of stillness that hung heavy with expectation. Jamal stood at the front of the room, adjusting the papers in his hand. His heart pounded as he looked out at the small but growing group of people who had gathered. The faces before him carried a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, their voices could finally be heard. Tyrone sat near the back, clutching his sketch pad. On its pages was a drawing he'd spent hours perfecting, a powerful image of hands joined together, rising against a backdrop of shadowy figures in police uniforms. Above the hands, the word "enough" was written in bold, defiant letters. It was a message Tyrone wanted to share, though his stomach churned at the thought of standing before the crowd. Jamal took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for being here. I know how much courage it took for each of you to show up. We're here because we've had enough of being silenced, enough of being intimidated, enough of living in fear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jamal continued, his voice gaining strength. Officer Moore has abused his position for years, and we've let it slide because we were scared. But silence only gives him more power. It's time to take that power back. He gestured toward the table where a laptop was set up. We've collected stories, evidence, and testimonies. Together, we can build a case strong enough to force the department to take action. But we need more people to come forward. If we stand together, they can't ignore us. Malik was the first to speak. He stood, his tall frame tense but determined. Moore has been targeting me since I was 15, stopping me for no reason, searching me like I'm some kind of criminal. The last time, he threatened to arrest me just for standing outside my own house. Keisha followed, holding her toddler on her hip. He followed me home one night, accused me of being on drugs because I was tired from work. I was terrified he'd do something worse. One by one, others shared their stories. Each voice added to the growing picture of Moore's pattern of abuse. Tyron listened, his grip on his sketchpad tightening with every account. The fear and humiliation these people described mirrored his own experiences, but hearing them speak gave him a sense of solidarity. He wasn't alone. As the testimonies continued, a woman in her 40s stood hesitantly. Her name was Gloria, and she had lived in Masonville her entire life. "My son," she began, her voice cracking, "he's in prison now because of Moore. He planted drugs on him, I know it, but no one would believe us." The room fell silent. Gloria's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes they were up against. Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady. "This is why we're here. Not just for ourselves, but for those who've been silenced, who've been crushed by this system. We can't change the past, but we can fight for a better future." He glanced at Tyrone, nodding subtly. Tyrone's heart pounded as he stood, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him. Slowly, he made his way to the front of the room, holding his sketchpad close to his chest. The room watched him with quiet curiosity. Tyrone took a deep breath and turned the sketchpad around, revealing his drawing. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the image sank in. The joined hands, the looming shadows, the word "enough" seemed to resonate deeply with everyone present. "This is how I feel," Tyrone said, his voice trembling but determined. "I can't fight like Jamal, but I can do this. If we're going to stand together, we need something that shows we're united." Jamal smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's exactly what we need." "Thank you, Ty." The room erupted into applause. For the first time in days, Tyrone felt a flicker of hope. He sat down, his face burning with embarrassment but his heart lighter. The meeting concluded with a plan. Jamal and a few others would organize a peaceful protest in the town square, using Tyrone's drawing as their symbol. They would create flyers, posters, and social media posts to spread the word. Lisa, the journalist, offered to write an article exposing Moore's actions, using the testimonies gathered as evidence. As the group dispersed, Jamal pulled Tyrone aside. "You did good tonight, little man." Tyrone managed a small smile. "You think it'll work?" Jamal placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, but we have to try." The days leading up to the protest were a whirlwind of activity. The community rallied together, printing posters and sharing stories online. Tyrone's drawing became the centerpiece of the movement, appearing on signs and in social media posts with the hashtag #EnoughMasonville. The response was overwhelming, with people from neighboring towns expressing their support. But not everyone was pleased. The police department issued a statement denying the accusations, calling them unfounded and inflammatory. Moore himself remained silent, though his presence in the community was felt more strongly than ever. Patrol cars lingered longer in black neighborhoods, and officers watched Jamal and his allies with thinly veiled suspicion. One evening, as Jamal and Tyrone returned home from a planning meeting, they found their mother waiting for them on the porch. Deborah's face was etched with worry. "Jamal, Tyrone," she said, her voice firm, "we need to talk." She ushered them inside, closing the door behind her. "I got a call today from someone at the diner. They said Moore's been asking questions about us, about you two." Jamal frowned. "What kind of questions?" "Personal ones," Deborah said. "Where you've been, who you've been meeting with." "Jamal, I'm scared. What if he tries to hurt you?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we have to keep going, Ma. He's trying to intimidate us, but we can't back down." Deborah sighed heavily, her fear evident. "Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose either of you." "We will, Ma," Jamal assured her. "I promise." That night, Tyrone lay awake, his thoughts racing. The fear he had carried for so long was still there, but it was now tempered by something stronger, a determination to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone Moore had hurt. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought of the protest, of the people who had come together to demand justice, and of the hands in his drawing, united against the darkness. The morning of the protest dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself knew the gravity of what was about to happen in Masonville. Tyrone woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and determination. He could hear Jamal downstairs, already up, discussing last-minute details on the phone. The house hummed with a sense of purpose, every movement deliberate, every word cautious but hopeful. Tyrone got dressed slowly, pulling on a plain shirt and jeans. As he reached for his sketchbook, his eyes landed on the drawing that had become a symbol for the movement. He traced the bold lines of the joined hands with his finger, feeling a small swell of pride. Today was about more than just one person. This was about standing up to a system that had tried to break them down. In the kitchen, Deborah was making breakfast, her face lined with worry. She glanced up when Tyrone entered, forcing a smile. "You ready, sweetheart?" Tyrone nodded, though he felt anything but ready. "Yeah, I'm ready." She walked over to him, pulling him into a tight hug. "You stay close to Jamal, okay? And if anything happens, you run. Don't you worry about anyone else, you just run and get yourself to safety." "I will, Ma," Tyrone said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. He could hear the fear in her voice, and it made his own heart squeeze painfully. Jamal appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of determination. "You two ready? We should head over to the square." Deborah gave Jamal a long, hard look. "You take care of your brother, no matter what." Jamal nodded solemnly. "I promise, Ma." The square was already filling with people when they arrived. Tyrone could see the colorful signs, many of them bearing the image he had drawn, held high in defiance. The crowd was a mix of young and old, black and white, people from all walks of life who had come together for one purpose. Tyrone felt a surge of hope as he took in the scene. Maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. Jamal led Tyrone to the center of the square, where Lisa, the journalist, was setting up her camera. She greeted them with a nod, her eyes scanning the growing crowd. "This is a good turnout," she said. "Better than I expected." "People are ready for change," Jamal replied, his eyes fixed on the stage that had been set up for the speakers. "It's about time." The protest officially began at noon. Jamal was one of the first to speak, his voice carrying across the square with a power that made Tyrone's chest swell with pride. He spoke of the injustices that had plagued Masonville for years, of the fear that people had lived with, and of the hope that things could be different. The crowd cheered, their voices blending into a single, powerful roar of support. Tyron watched as others took the stage: Malik, Keisha, Gloria. Each of them shared their story, their voice strong and unyielding. Tyron could see the way the crowd responded, the way people nodded and wiped away tears, the way they cheered when someone spoke of standing up against the oppression they had faced. It was empowering, a moment that felt like it was filled with real possibility. But even amidst the hope, there was an undercurrent of tension. Tyron noticed the police officers standing at the edge of the square, their faces expressionless, their hands resting on their belts. Moore wasn't there, but his presence was felt nonetheless, like a dark cloud hanging over the gathering. The officers watched the crowd with cold eyes, and Tyrone could feel their scrutiny every time he glanced in their direction. As Jamal stepped down from the stage, he made his way back to where Tyrone was standing. He gave his brother a reassuring smile. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Tyrone said, though his heart was still pounding. "You did great up there." Jamal clapped him on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Ty. We're making our voices heard. That's what matters." Suddenly, there was a commotion at the edge of the square. Tyron turned his head, his eyes widening as he saw a group of officers pushing their way through the crowd, their expressions hard. They were heading straight for the stage, and Tyron felt his stomach drop. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic. Jamal's face darkened. "They're trying to shut us down." The lead officer, a burly man with a stern expression, climbed onto the stage, raising a megaphone. "This gathering is unauthorized," he announced, his voice amplified across the square. "You are all instructed to disperse immediately. Failure to comply will result in arrests." The crowd reacted with a mixture of anger and fear. People began shouting in protest, their voices clashing with the officer's commands. Jamal stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "We have a right to be here," he shouted. "This is a peaceful protest. We're not breaking any laws." The officer ignored him, turning his attention back to the crowd. "Disperse now or face consequences." Tyron's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. He could see the fear in people's eyes, the way they hesitated, torn between staying and fleeing. He looked at Jamal, who stood his ground, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Ty, stay close to me," Jamal said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, you stay with me." Before Tyron could respond, the officers moved in. They began pushing people back, their hands rough, their voices commanding. Panic spread through the crowd, and Tyron felt himself being jostled as people tried to move away from the advancing line of police. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and Tyrone turned to see a young man being thrown to the ground by one of the officers. The crowd erupted, people shouting in anger, some trying to pull the officer away, others trying to flee. Tyrone felt his breath catch in his throat, his body frozen with fear. "Ty, go!" Jamal shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the chaos. "Run!" Tyrone stumbled, his feet moving on instinct as Jamal led him through the crowd. They pushed their way through the mass of bodies, the shouts and cries ringing in Tyrone's ears. He could hear the officers behind them, their voices barking orders, the sound of scuffling and shouting growing louder. They made it to the edge of the square, and Jamal pulled Tyrone into an alley, pressing him against the wall. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't move until I come back for you." Tyron's eyes widened in panic. "No, Jamal, I can't." "Listen to me. Jamal said, his hands gripping Tyron's shoulders. "I have to make sure everyone else is okay. You stay here, no matter what." Tears stung Tyron's eyes, but he nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Jamal gave him one last look, then turned and ran back toward the square. Tyron watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to follow, to help, but he knew Jamal was right. He had to stay safe, for his mother's sake, for Jamal's sake. Minutes felt like hours as Tyron waited, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. He could hear the sounds of the protest, the shouting, the sirens, the chaos. He closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, trying to focus on the image of the hands he had drawn, joined together in unity. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. His eyes snapped open and his heart leapt into his throat when he saw who it was. Officer Moore. Moore's eyes locked onto Tyrone, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who we have here." Tyrone's body went rigid with fear. He glanced around, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Moore took a step closer, his smile widening. "Thought you could make a difference, huh? Thought you could stand up to me?" Tyrone swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "We have a right to be heard." Moore's expression darkened, and he grabbed Tyrone by the arm, his grip painfully tight. "You think you can challenge me, boy? You think you and your brother can take me down?" Tyrone winced, tears stinging his eyes. He tried to pull away, but Moore's grip was unrelenting. "You need to learn your place," Moore snarled, his face inches from Tyrone's, "and I'm going to make sure you do." Before Tyrone could react, Moore shoved him against the wall, his body pinned by the officer's weight. Tyrone struggled, panic surging through him, but Moore was too strong. "Maybe this will teach you to keep your mouth shut," Moore hissed, his hand moving to his belt, where his baton hung. Tyrone's heart pounded in his chest, fear choking him. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the blow, but before Moore could strike, a voice rang out. "Hey, get away from him!" Tyrone's eyes snapped open and he saw Jamal running toward them, his face twisted in fury. Without hesitation, Jamal lunged at Moore, knocking him away from Tyrone. "Run, Ty!" Jamal shouted, his voice hoarse. "Go!" Tyrone didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement, his heart racing. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was far away from the alley, from the square, from the chaos. He collapsed against a fence, his body shaking, tears streaming down his face. He could hear the distant sounds of the protest, the shouts and sirens fading into the background. He didn't know where Jamal was, if he was okay, if he was hurt. The fear and uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew he had to keep moving. He had to get home, had to let his mother know what had happened. As he got to his feet, his legs trembling, Tyrone felt something else, something that burned beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion. It was anger. Anger at Moore, at the system that allowed men like him to wield power unchecked. Anger at the fear that had kept their community silent for so long. They had tried to make their voices heard, and they had been silenced. But Tyrone knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. For Jamal, for his mother, for everyone who had stood in that square today, he would keep fighting. The storm over Masonville was far from over, and Tyrone was ready to face it. The following days were the longest of Tyrone's life. The protest had been broken up by the police, and Masonville had become a town under siege. Patrol cars roamed the streets, officers on edge, and an unmistakable tension hung in the air, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. After fleeing the protest, Tyron had run all the way home. When Deborah saw him, her face had gone pale. She pulled him into the house and wrapped him in her arms, her questions spilling out in a rush. Where was Jamal? What had happened? Was he okay? Tyron's voice cracked as he explained how Jamal had saved him, how he had run back into the chaos to protect the others. Deborah's face had twisted in fear, and she called every number she could think of, trying to locate her older son. Hours later, they finally heard from Jamal. He had been arrested, along with several others, during the protest. Deborah's tears flowed freely as she listened to her son's voice over the scratchy jailhouse phone, promising her he was okay, that he would be out soon. The charges were minor: disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. Nothing that could keep him locked up for long, but enough to serve as a warning. Enough to try and make him stop. Deborah spent the next few days working to get Jamal released, visiting the police station, talking to lawyers, trying to navigate a system designed to make her feel small and powerless. Tyron stayed home, barely able to eat or sleep. He drew, sketch after sketch, the images dark and angry, an outlet for the fear and frustration boiling inside of him. When Jamal finally came home, bruised and exhausted but alive, Deborah pulled him into her arms, her tears of relief soaking his shirt. Tyron watched from the doorway, his own heart pounding with a mix of relief and rage. Seeing his brother, seeing the toll the last few days had taken on him, made something click inside Tyrone. He realized that no matter what happened, they couldn't give up. They had come too far to let fear win now. Jamal sat down with Tyrone later that evening, their mother having gone to rest for the first time in days. He looked at his younger brother, a tired but determined smile on his face. "I'm sorry I scared you, Ty," he said, his voice rough. "I had to make sure people were safe." "I know," Tyron replied, his eyes welling up. "I was just so scared, Jamal. I thought—" Jamal reached over, pulling Tyrone into a hug. "It's okay, Ty. We're still here. We're still fighting." Tyron pulled back, wiping his eyes. "What's next? We can't let them win." Jamal's eyes hardened. "No, we can't. But we have to be smart about it. We need proof, something they can't bury or deny." That was when Lisa, the journalist, entered the picture once again. She had been present at the protest, documenting everything from a distance. Her camera had captured the heavy-handed police tactics, the brutality used to break up a peaceful gathering, and, most importantly, it had captured more. Cornering Tyron, shoving him against the wall, Jamal intervening. The footage was damning, a clear abuse of power. Lisa came to their house one evening, her face serious as she explained what she had. "This footage shows exactly what happened. It's evidence that Moore and the police department overstepped their bounds. We need to release this. Let people see the truth." Jamal hesitated. But will it be enough? They have the power to bury this, spin it however they want. "Not if we make enough noise," Lisa said, her eyes fierce. "Not if we make it impossible for them to ignore." Together, they devised a plan. Lisa would publish the footage online, accompanied by testimonies from the people who had been there, the stories of those who had suffered at Moore's hands. They would share it with local and national media, leverage social media to make it go viral, to force the town and the world to pay attention. The night before the footage went live, Tyrone sat in his room, staring at his sketchbook. He turned to the drawing he had made for the protest. The hands joined together, the word "enough" scrawled across the top. He picked up his pencil and began to draw again, adding more hands, each one different, reaching out, gripping each other tightly. Above them, he wrote, "We are stronger together." When the article and the footage were released, the response was immediate. People in Masonville and beyond reacted with outrage, their anger pouring out in comments, messages, calls to action. The footage of Moore shoving Tyrone against the wall, of Jamal stepping in to protect his brother, went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly Masonville, once a quiet town where injustices were swept under the rug, was thrust into the spotlight. The pressure mounted. The mayor of Masonville, previously silent on the issue, was forced to make a statement. He called for an independent investigation into the actions of the police during the protest. The police chief, faced with mounting scrutiny, placed Moore on administrative leave. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Jamal and Tyrone watched the news together, their mother sitting between them, her hand resting on Tyrone's shoulder. When the anchor announced that Moore was under investigation, Tyrone felt a surge of emotion, relief, vindication, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. The following days were a blur of interviews, meetings, and cautious celebration. The community rallied around the Harris family, offering their support and solidarity. Malik, Keisha, Gloria, all those who had been too afraid to speak before found their voices, their courage bolstered by the movement that had begun to take root. One evening, Jamal and Tyrone walked to the center of town, to the place where the protest had been held. The square was quiet now, but the memory of that day lingered in the air. Jamal turned to his brother, his expression somber. "We've come a long way, Ty," he said, "but this isn't the end. There's still so much work to do." Tyrone nodded. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, that there would be setbacks, that the fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time he felt like they were on the right path, that they had the strength and the support they needed to keep going. Jamal smiled, resting a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, little man. You stood up when it mattered most." Tyrone looked up at his brother, his heart swelling with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you." They stood there in silence for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. Tyrone looked at the spot where he had been pinned against the wall by Moore, where Jamal had rushed in to save him. He thought of all the fear, the pain, the anger, and he thought of how far they had come since that day. As they turned to leave, Tyrone pulled his sketchbook from his bag, flipping to the drawing of the joined hands. He tore the page from the book and walked over to the wall, taping it up for everyone to see. "Stronger together," he whispered, the words carrying a weight that felt real and powerful. Jamal nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "Yeah, together." As they walked home, Tyrone knew that they were at the beginning of something bigger, a movement that had started in Masonville but could reach so much further. It was a fight that would take time, effort, and courage, but they were ready. The storm that had once loomed over the town had begun to break, and in its place, a new dawn was rising. The hands in Tyrone's drawing reached out, joined together, and this time he knew they would not let go. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more meaningful content. Check out our other videos for stories that inspire and provoke thought. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and let's continue the conversation together.